Thank you very much. Mine is not going to be quite as scintillating. I'm going to be talking to you from the perspective of the expectations of licensed physicians. We are back to the topic of cannabis for medical purposes. And I just also want to highlight that I am not representing medical regulatory agencies. They are in fact authorities. Okay, so that's quite a different little distinction. I did not put in a disclosure slide, bad me. I have no commercial conflict of interest, but the new question is that about affiliation with a not-for-profit, and I am a full-time employee of a national not-for-profit. So the objectives are to hope that you will understand our position and the position of our members on cannabis for medical purposes, to appreciate the nuances in the guidance provided to physicians, and to consider the interface between cannabis for medical purposes and cannabis for recreational purposes. I'm going to talk to you about who we are and what medical regulation is, a little bit of the historical landscape of our involvement on this file, some of the quandaries we're facing on this, the regulatory guidance. I'm actually going to take you through some regulatory guidance. The new interfaces that are posed with this particular product and the challenges ahead. So we are the Federation of Medical Regulatory Authorities of Canada. Our mission is to advance medical regulation on behalf of the public through collaboration, common standards, and best practices. But I want to highlight three things. While our members are regulatory, FEMRAC is not. Okay, we are simply a member-based organization assembling the MRAs. We also have no authority over our members, so if you say, you know, Ontario's not following your policy, what are you going to do? Well, chances are we're not going to be able to do much. We produce draft guidelines and we hope that they are adapted or adopted by our members. And finally, we've been around for a while. We turned 50 this year. We're going to do that in June in Charlottetown. And our members are other organizations, the 13 provincial and territorial medical regulatory authorities. So what is it that they do? So as Mark said, the practice of medicine is regulated by each province and territory. So we have the interface with the federal government that regulates prescription drugs, other products, and other procedures, for instance, medical assistance in dying. Our medical regulatory authorities have statutory authority, and they exercise their duty in the best interest of the public. I actually ran my presentation by several of the registrars around the country, especially if I quote something from their standards or guidelines. I like to make sure that I'm using the latest version. And that is the one change that was made. They changed the word delegated to statutory authority, and I use delegated because regulatory authorities, be they for medicine or another profession or a trade, exist to protect the public, and it is the government's role to protect the public. So they actually delegate that role. In this instance, for licensed physicians, they delegate that to the medical regulatory authorities. And their focus is patient safety. So to achieve this, the medical regulatory authorities provide guidance to assist licensed physicians in complying with regulations and legislation. So I began my job at FEMRAC in 2003, and I was telling our Australian colleagues that please, please, please do not remove the oyster farms and replace them with marijuana farms, because I really like Australian pearls. And this pearl was actually purchased for me by my organization for my 15 years of service. So there's nothing like an Australian South Seas pearl. They're expensive, but you know what the heck, I'm a princess. So one of the things that was always interesting for what was called marijuana for medical purposes back then was that marijuana was spelled with an H and not a J. Okay, so there's a story to that. We can ask Eric, maybe he can expand on that a little bit. I think I know why, but we're not 100% sure. We had a policy that we developed in 2004 that actually doesn't mention marijuana or cannabis at all, but it is a policy we developed for that purpose, and it's still in effect today. And it simply states that FEMRAC strongly believes that the practice of medicine should be evidence-based and that physicians should not be asked to prescribe or dispense substances or treatments for which there is little or no evidence of clinical efficacy or safety. We consider that when it comes to cannabis for medical purposes, this policy still stands 14 years later. It was very interesting because we were telling Health Canada, and this was before Eric's time on the file, I believe, and and they were saying, okay, fine, but what should the dosage be? I was saying, well, figure it out, okay? So it went dormant for a little while, and then things started to rev up again about 6 years later. And in 2011, we were consulted on the proposed improvements to Health Canada's marijuana, still with an H, medical access program. So now from marijuana for medical purposes to marijuana medical access program. And now we're going from a situation where physicians had been asked to simply confirm a medical diagnosis to one where physicians were actually issuing an authorization to provide access to cannabis for medical purposes. For us, it was a little bit like jumping from the frying pan into the fire. So we had opposed this, and now we were opposing something that we felt was even more difficult for the regulatory authorities. This is when we were the most active on the file. So we kept telling them this is not a medical intervention. The lack of evidence is a significant and grave concern for the medical regulatory authorities. We think there's considerable evidence about drug dependency, and we kept telling Health Canada that physicians should not be the gatekeeper to access to marijuana for medical purposes. Kept at it, and one of the things that was really interesting is when we did the consultations, that our feedback was simply one of many sources of feedback. So the medical regulatory authorities and other professional regulatory authorities, we do not think, at least we were told it was none of our business when we consulted Health Canada about how are you gauging the feedback received. They said it was none of our business how it was done. So we were left believing that we were simply one of many, and the many could be 5 million Canadians for all we knew. So we also felt that the resulting conflict could put licensed physicians at risk with their medical regulatory authorities, as the MRAs had no choice but to continue to advise them to exercise extreme caution. At the time, it was the first time and the only time that I know of where we hired a professional lobbying firm. And it was interesting because they kept trying to tell us to say things we didn't want to say, like marijuana doesn't work. We have never said marijuana doesn't work. We just said show us the evidence that it does, okay? We also felt, and this did not pan out, I do not think, that physicians and their families could be at risk of personal danger. Because at the time, they were talking about possibly dispensing the product too. And we countered. We gave them 3 options, and we said everything else we think is inappropriate. Retain the status quo. This is, the situation where better the devil you know, where physicians were simply confirming a medical diagnosis and now having physicians provide an authorization to use. Treat marijuana as any other prescribed drug. Put it through the 4 stages of clinical trials. Do the research, have a legitimate producer, and have an approved prescribed drug distribution process. And then we said, failing that, legalize it. And we meant all of it, okay? But at the time, we were only talking about cannabis for medical purposes. We suggested this again to the task force that Eric mentioned, and Mark, who co-chaired the task force, simply ignored us. Anyway, it did not work. So it's a bit of a really good lesson for us, because after all, we represent the regulatory authorities, and we're being told no, no, no along the way. We do continue to push for research, and at the time there was an expert panel that everybody said, let's convene. We said, yes, convene the expert panel, and once you've got supporting evidence, if ever, consider that changes to the program should be made. And then we said something that got us into even more hot water. If it is a product that must be distributed, pharmacists should be doing the dispensing. Now, it's interesting because I know there are pharmacy people here, but at the time, the National Association of Pharmacy Regulatory Authorities was not happy with us. So, things change, don't they? So now we're not going to do the Tour de France, we're going to do the Tour de Pays, and I'm going to provide you with examples. Now, the important thing about these examples is that they're going to address some of the concerns that I've been trying to raise that we've shared with Health Canada. I'm going to wrap this up towards the end. But these are actual guidelines and standards, and I'm quoting several of the medical regulatory authorities. I'm giving you the links to those sites on every slide, but there's no point me doing anything but reading them, because every single word in a regulatory guideline or standard of practice has been agonized over. I know that's not proper English sentence construction. By the way, I'm very French-Canadian, and if you find the name Fleur-Ange difficult, rest assured that French Canadians also find it difficult. It's a very unusual name, and I was telling Mark and Bryce this morning, if you Google my given name, Fleur-Ange, which means flower-angel, literally, you will find me on page 1. You don't forget Lefebvre, which is also a bugger to spell, but you will find, you don't need to put it in, but the dash is important, okay? So at the Collège des Médecins du Québec, it's important to note that that regulatory authority is a bit different. It has a broader mandate than the other regulatory authorities. It's also a certifying college, and it also develops clinical practice standards. So they said that the use of cannabis for medical purposes is not a recognized treatment. Full stop. An unrecognized treatment can only be used within a research framework. Enter a collaboration with Mark and his group at McGill. Every patient for whom an authorization to use marijuana is, every patient who gets an authorization to use marijuana in Quebec must be enrolled in a research protocol. Going to the other end of the country, at the College of Physicians and Surgeons of British Columbia, this is a standard, and a standard has a higher level of enforceability than a guideline. Physicians are advised that they should not prescribe any substances for their patients without knowing the risks, benefits, potential complications, and drug interactions associated with the use of that agent. Physicians may be subject of accusations or suggestions of negligence, including liability in the use of cannabis produces if the use produces unforeseen or unidentified negative effects. This also highlights something, right? The regs talk about authorization, and we were so strict at the beginning never to use the word prescribing. But we want physicians to approach us like a prescribed drug. So you have to use the word prescribing. It just made it easier. Moving a little bit further east to Alberta, it's also a standard of practice. Health Canada has approved the use of cannabis for medical purposes. Physicians have the choice to treat or not to treat their patients' medical condition or symptoms with cannabis. Okay? Saskatchewan has enshrined it in information about expectations. And this is now getting to be quite a bit more specific. Physicians can only prescribe medical cannabis if they are the primary treating physician for the condition for which it is being prescribed. So this one-off, come to me, I'm your cannabis doctor, is not supposed to happen, at least in the province of Saskatchewan. And they felt that physicians are being placed in a difficult position by being expected to make decisions whether to provide a medical document to patients when there is insufficient information. Cannabis is a substance which is not subject to any of the regulatory controls which are required of all other drugs, okay? You begin to get the idea. Ontario is a position statement, and now we're getting more specific. The document required under the regs is equivalent to a prescription, okay? Physicians who prescribe marijuana must comply with the expectations set out in the policy as well as the expectations and guidelines for prescribing that are set out in the college's prescribing drugs policy. So tightening everything, you know, this is not a different product. It is and it isn't from the perspective of the practicing doc, okay? Nova Scotia has a professional standard. We consider the authorization of marijuana for medical purposes to be a clinical act and insured service. So you now see we're tightening the issues that have come up all over the country. And by the way, a lot of these things arise in other policies and standards around the country. I'm just pulling out the ones where I felt the language was clearest. This is just part of the information. Newfoundland and Labrador, I know we are furthest east, but I think I'll be coming back to Manitoba. It is a guideline, and they strongly discourage physicians from dispensing marijuana. And finally, Manitoba. Manitoba enshrines it in a bylaw. A member may not be legally or beneficially involved in any way with a licensed producer and may not directly make any application to become a licensed producer. So separating the medical act from personal gain. So we have had several interactions with Health Canada when Eric was on this file, and now his colleague David, about the quantities authorized, which can vary significantly. And then, of course, we had the purchased cannabis versus the product grown by or on behalf of the patient, and the issue came up again about the dosage versus the quantity of plants allowed. And then, of course, we have this famous issue of cannabis for medical purposes and cannabis for recreational purposes. There is another product that dealt with this, that produced the same interface, and that was alcohol. Up until a few years ago, many jurisdictions, I think 3 of them still have it in their statutes, you could prescribe alcohol for a patient. Now, that is slowly disappearing, but how many other products that are identical are subject to a prescription and to simply going and purchasing it? So it's not an easy interface, and we're a little bit worried about how that is going to pan out. Personal, this is purely personal. As an owner of a condo, for the people from Australia and New Zealand, that's an apartment that you buy versus an apartment that you rent. We are a little bit concerned, as a board member on my condo board, that if you have 4 adults living in a place and they can only grow 4 plants because it's 4 plants per resident, how are they going to decide to act if it means that they can increase the number of plants? Come on, So let's just take us back to what we talked about. We talked about lack of evidence, and this should be of effectiveness and safety, and evidence of drug dependency. We think that's still an issue today. However, the medical regulatory authorities have to balance this with the fact that we have Health Canada regulations that permit physicians to authorize the product. And we have to balance it with patient autonomy. We still want research protocols. And there are ongoing dosage issues, especially given that it's really hard to titrate out the product, especially if you're growing it yourself. The next issue we talked about was it's not a recognized medical treatment or intervention. So physicians have the choice to treat or not to treat with medical cannabis. They are being advised to proceed with caution. And here's an example. I was talking to Chris at my table earlier about, physicians whose career is prescribing cannabis. We're of 2 minds on that. On the one hand, they don't have the continuity of the physician-patient relationship necessarily, and that is part of good medical practice. But on the other hand, if they have become experts on this topic, then everything's a balancing act. And we have to tell physicians that they must behave as if prescribing any other drug. So the patient-physician relationship is important. They need to know about any possible interactions, and there has to be an assessment of addiction risks. And also, physicians should not be the gatekeepers for access to marijuana for medical purposes. They should not dispense. We had another issue with mifegomiso on that. I don't know if anybody viewed the abortion pill, where the initial regs had physicians dispensing, and we fought that, and I think we won that one. That would be pretty good. So, physicians should not be dispensing unless they're way up north and there's nobody else who can, or isolated and there's nobody else who can dispense. You need to remove that from the interaction between the physician and the patient. Physicians are not to become or be associated with a licensed producer. And authorizations are a clinical act and an insured service. You're not allowed to charge for that. I can just imagine the looks I'm going to get later on when I said that. So, okay. Thank you very much, and I will answer questions when Dr. Ware deems it appropriate.